It started like any other evening, but what unfolded changed my life forever. When I pushed open the front door, something immediately caught my eye. A manila envelope taped to the inside of the glass. Bold, hurried letters on the front demanded, "Open now." A strange chill ran down my spine. My first thought was Emma. Perhaps it was from her, though the handwriting was far from her neat, measured script. My pulse quickened as I tore the envelope open. Inside was a single photograph, grainy but unmistakable. Emma, sitting at a dimly lit bar. She wore a sleek black dress I had never seen before, her hair styled in a way she hadn't done for me in years. My stomach dropped as I noticed the man next to her, younger, maybe by a decade. Her arm rested easily over his shoulder, and his hand lay firmly on her thigh. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My first reaction was disbelief. It had to be a joke, a misunderstanding. But when I flipped the photo over, my gut twisted further. A handwritten note, in the same messy scrawl as the envelope, read, "This isn't the first time. You deserve to know the truth." No name, no explanation, just a warning that left my mind racing. Who would send this? How did they know where I lived? And what exactly did they mean by "this isn't the first time"? I dropped the photo onto the counter and began pacing the room, every muscle in my body tense. Emma had been distant lately, sure, secretive even. She'd started coming home late, blaming work dinners or unexpected meetings. I wanted to believe her, I always had. But this was something else entirely. I grabbed my phone and called her, straight to voicemail, again. My hands clenched around the device as frustration and dread churned inside me. Just as I was about to hurl the phone across the room, the doorbell rang. I nearly tripped over myself rushing to the door, my mind racing with possibilities. Emma, maybe, ready with some explanation? But when I flung it open, it was just a delivery driver. "Nathan Parker?" he asked, glancing down at a clipboard. "Yeah, that's me," I managed, my voice strained. He handed over a small, plain box and walked away without another word. There was no return address, no markings of any kind. It was so light it felt almost empty. I didn't even make it to the kitchen before tearing it open. Inside was a single flash drive. No note, no explanation, just the drive. My hands shook as I plugged it into my laptop. One file, a video. I hesitated for a moment, bracing myself for what might come next, and then clicked it open. The screen flickered to life with shaky footage of a hotel hallway. My breath hitched as Emma stepped into the frame. She was holding hands with the man from the photo. They laughed softly, oblivious to the camera tracking their every move. Reaching a door, he pulled out a key card, and moments later, they disappeared inside together. The video ended abruptly, leaving me staring at the blank screen. My jaw tightened, my hands balled into fists. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was real. Emma was cheating on me, but the question that burned in my mind wasn't just why she did it. It was who sent this and why. Whoever they were, they wanted me to know. They wanted me to feel this fury, this humiliation. And more than anything, they wanted me to act, and act I would. I didn't know who was pulling the strings, but I wasn't going to sit back and let Emma destroy everything we built without answers. Whatever game this was, I was ready to play. The next morning, I was jolted awake by a loud knock on the door, groggy, and still simmering with residual anger. I stumbled to answer it. Standing there was a man I'd never seen before, tall, sharply dressed in a gray suit, and carrying a leather briefcase. "Mr. Parker?" he asked, his tone brisk and professional. "Yes, who are you are? Yes, I replied, narrowing my eyes. Without a word, he handed me a business card. It read, "Evan Miller, attorney at law." "I'm representing your wife, Emma," he said, his voice detached and practiced. "She's requested that all communication go through me from this point forward. I have some documents for you to review." His words hit me like a sledgehammer, but I forced myself to remain composed. "She didn't have the decency to tell me this in person?" I asked, my voice cold and controlled. He didn't flinch. "I'm just here to deliver the documents," he replied, opening his briefcase to pull out a thick stack of papers. Divorce papers. She wasn't just serious. She was moving at full speed. "Tell me something, Evan," I said, holding up the envelope with the damning photo. My tone was laced with contempt. "Does she know what's in this?" For the first time, his composed mask cracked. His eyes flicked to the envelope, then back to me, a brief, almost imperceptible hesitation. "What are you talking about, Dosada?" he asked, trying to sound indifferent, but there was an edge to his voice now. "You're her lawyer, right? I assume she's been upfront with you about everything? Or has she conveniently left out a few details?" I leaned closer, watching him squirm. "You might want to ask her about a little hotel escapade with her boyfriend. I've got photos. I've got video." Evan shifted on his feet, his composure faltering further. I have no knowledge of that," he stammered. "I bet you don't," I shot back, a grim smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "Why don't you go ahead and confirm it with your client? But tell her this: she doesn't get to burn down my life and walk away unscathed." Before he could respond, I slammed the door in his face. My pulse was racing, my blood boiling. Emma had blindsided me, but now I had her lawyer rattled. I sat down at the dining table, staring at the stack of papers in front of me. The audacity of it all made my hands tremble. She wanted to erase me from her life and expected me to roll over and comply. Not a chance. I flipped through the documents, searching for anything that might give me an edge. That's when I saw it. A clause about financial disclosure. Emma was required to provide a full account of her assets and liabilities. An idea began to form in my mind, fueled by anger and a growing determination to expose her lies. If she thought she could steamroll me, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Detective Harris," the voice said. "It's Nathan Parker," I replied. "I need your help, and I need it fast." Harris didn't miss a beat. "What's going on?" I looked at the envelope, the flash drive, and the divorce papers spread out in front of me. "Let's just say my wife has been keeping secrets, and I need someone who knows how to dig." As I hung up, I felt the first spark of control returning to me. Emma thought she had me cornered, but she underestimated me. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next morning, I walked into Evan Miller's office at precisely 10 a.m., the agreed time for our meeting. The receptionist barely looked up as she gestured toward the conference room. I stood, grabbing my bag, and started toward the door. Before leaving, I turned back to Evan, who looked like he'd just been hit by a truck. "And Evan," I said, smiling coldly, "you might want to reconsider your approach. You're representing someone who's about to lose everything. Don't let her take you down with her." I didn't wait for his reply. As I walked out of the building, I felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't just about exposing Emma anymore. It was about reclaiming control of my life. And this was just the beginning. I didn't have to wait long for the fallout. By the time I got home that afternoon, my phone was already buzzing non-stop. 3 missed calls from Emma. A text popped up as I unlocked the screen. "We need to talk. Call me. Now." I smirked, tossed the phone on the counter, and grabbed a drink from the fridge. Let her stew for a while. She was so used to pulling the strings. But now the puppet show was over. About an hour later, the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, there she was. Emma stood on the threshold, arms crossed tightly, her face a mix of anger and defiance. She was dressed like she had just walked out of an important boardroom, a sleek blouse, a tailored skirt, and heels that clicked sharply as she stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk," she demanded, spinning around to face me. I closed the door slowly, each movement deliberate, and leaned against the wall, crossing my arms. "I figured you'd show up sooner or later," I said, my tone casual but laced with steel. "What's the crisis, Emma? Did your boyfriend finally ditch you?" Her eyes flared, a flash of guilt flickering for the briefest moment before she masked it with indignation. "I don't know what kind of twisted stunt you think you're pulling, Nathan, but involving my lawyer, sending him those ridiculous accusations, that's low, even for you." "Ridiculous accusations?" I shot back, my voice calm but sharp. "Are you really going to stand there and deny everything? The transfers, the hotel receipts, the video, none of it is real? Do you want me to lay out all the evidence right now, or would you rather I save it for court?" For a moment her composure faltered, then her face hardened. her jaw tightening as she countered, "You're making a big deal out of nothing. Jake is just a friend. The transfers were loans. And the hotel?" She hesitated, grasping for credibility. "We were meeting with clients. It's not what you think." A bitter laugh erupted from me, cold and cutting. "Clients? That's your excuse? Do you take me for a fool, or do you just enjoy insulting my intelligence?" Her mask cracked further, the strain showing in her eyes. Finally, she threw up her hands in exasperation. "Fine," she snapped. "You want the truth? Yes, I've been seeing Jake. But can you honestly blame me? You've been so consumed with your work that you haven't noticed how miserable I've been for years." "Miserable?" I repeated, my voice rising with disbelief. "Living in the house I paid for, spending the money I earned, enjoying the life I built for us. That's what you call misery?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze dropping briefly to the floor. "You don't understand," she muttered. "You never did." I took a step closer, my voice low but unwavering. "Oh, I understand perfectly," I said. "You're a liar, a cheater, and a coward, and now you're trying to paint yourself as the victim because you got caught." Her head snapped up, her eyes narrowing with fury. "You think you're so righteous," she hissed. "But let's not pretend you're perfect, Nathan. You've made your share of mistakes, too." I let out a slow breath, keeping my composure. "Maybe I have," I said quietly. "But I never betrayed you. I never turned my back on the promises we made to each other." The room fell silent, the weight of everything unsaid settling between us. Whatever love or trust had once existed between us had been shattered, leaving nothing but the cold reality of what we'd become. Finally, Emma grabbed her purse and broke the silence. "If it's a fight you want, it's a fight you'll get," she said, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. "But don't forget, Nathan, I have my own cards to play." She turned on her heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed door, my fists clenched so tightly my knuckles ached. Her parting words weren't just a threat. They were a declaration of war. And if Emma wanted a war, she was about to learn what happens when you push a man too far. The next morning, I awoke to chaos. My phone buzzed relentlessly, notification after notification flooding the screen. Emails, missed calls, and messages from numbers I hadn't seen in years. Confused, I grabbed my phone and started scrolling. "Hey, Nathan, is everything okay? Man, I heard the rumors. What's going on with you and Emma? Saw the post. Call me if you need anything." A chill crept down my spine as I opened one of the messages containing a screenshot. My stomach churned as I read the caption under a series of carefully chosen photos of Emma looking heartbroken. "Sometimes you have to stand up for yourself," it read. "After years in a loveless marriage, I'm finally choosing my happiness. Don't judge what you don't understand." The comments were a flood of sympathy and outrage, strangers and acquaintances alike rallying behind her carefully curated narrative. I could feel my anger bubbling to the surface. This wasn't just damage control. This was a calculated move to rewrite the story, to cast herself as the victim before I could expose the truth. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think clearly. Reacting in anger would only play into her hands. If I wanted to counter this, I had to be strategic. I called Detective Harris. "It's time to take this to the next level," I said firmly. "Good timing," he replied. "I've been digging into things, and you're going to want to see this." An hour later, I was seated across from him in a small, nondescript office. He slid a folder across the table, his expression grim but satisfied. "Emma's been busy," he said, flipping it open to reveal a stack of documents and photos. "Those bank transfers," he continued. "Turns out Jake Patterson isn't just her boyfriend." Detective Harris leaned forward, his expression grim yet triumphant. "Jake Patterson isn't just her boyfriend," he said, flipping through the stack of papers. "He's also been funneling money from your joint account into an offshore account. The guy's a scam artist, plain and simple." I stared at the evidence laid out in front of me, each piece clicking into place like the final turns of a lock. Emma wasn't just unfaithful. She was financing this guy's lifestyle with our money, my money. "And it gets worse," Harris continued, his tone clinical. "I ran a background check on Jake. Turns out he has a history of running cons on women like Emma, wines and dines them, drains their accounts, and disappears the moment they're tapped out. The anger that had been simmering inside me now burned uncontrollably. Emma had betrayed me, lied to me, and humiliated me. And for what? To bankroll a con man's fantasy? What's the next step? I asked, my voice steady despite the fire raging within. Harris leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. That depends on how public you want to go. We can file a police report, press charges for fraud, and subpoena financial records to show she's complicit. But it's going to get messy. Messy is fine, I said, my jaw tight. She wanted a war, Harris. I'm just making sure she knows the price. I left his office with the folder in hand, a plan taking shape in my mind. Emma had tried to rewrite the story, to cast herself as the victim, but now it was my turn to set the record straight. That evening, I sat at my desk, crafting my response. This wouldn't be a rant or a smear campaign. It would be a calculated statement, stripped of emotion, and backed by cold, hard evidence. I attached just enough documentation to dismantle her lies without showing all my cards. As I hovered over the Publish button, I hesitated for a moment. Then, with a sharp exhale, I clicked. The truth was out. The response was immediate. Notifications poured in as people commented, messaged, and shared the post. The tide had turned. The sympathy Emma had garnered began to erode under the weight of the facts. The comments under her original post transformed into demands for answers, accusations, and disbelief. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a sense of control. This wasn't over, but the opening salvo had landed, and I was ready for what came next. The following morning, as I spoke with Harris on the phone, another notification popped up. "She's posted something else," Harris said before I could check. I opened her account to find a new post. The caption read, "To those spreading lies about me, you don't know the full story. Some people will do anything to tear others down, but I refuse to stoop to their level. The truth will come out in court." It was laughable. Emma was clinging to the narrative she'd spun, but it was riddled with holes. People weren't buying it anymore. The facade was crumbling. Not long after, my phone rang. It was Evan, her lawyer. "Mr. Parker," he began, his tone strained. "I think we need to discuss the situation before it escalates further." "Oh, it's already escalated," I replied, my voice cold. "And unless your client is ready to come clean and settle this the right way, we don't have much to talk about." There was a pause, followed by a reluctant sigh. "She's willing to negotiate," Evan said. "Negotiate?" I repeated, a bitter laugh escaping me. "She doesn't get to negotiate after everything she's done. This is her chance to walk away with whatever dignity she has left. If we meet in person, perhaps we can find a resolution," he suggested cautiously. I considered it, the thought of facing Emma again stirring a mix of anger and determination. "Fine," I said finally. "Set it up." 2 days later, I walked into Evan's office. Emma was already there, seated at the conference table. She looked drained, her usual confidence replaced by unease. She avoided my gaze as I sat down across from her. Evan cleared his throat, trying to cut through the tension. "Let's keep this civil," he began. "We're past civil, Evan," I said, my tone icy. "Let's talk about how this ends." Emma finally looked up, her eyes narrowing. "You've made your point, Nathan. You've humiliated me, dragged my name through the mud." "No," I interrupted, leaning forward. "You did that to yourself. All I did was reveal the truth. Don't you dare try to make me the villain here." Her jaw tightened, but she stayed silent. Evan began outlining settlement terms, but I barely listened. My focus was on Emma, watching her squirm under the weight of her own lies. This wasn't just about winning anymore. This was about making sure she understood the consequences of her choices. And as I walked out of that office, I knew she'd think twice before underestimating me again. I leaned forward, my tone calm but unrelenting. "I know about Jake's offshore account," I said, watching Emma's face carefully. "I know exactly how much money you funneled to him, and I know his history." Her face paled, fear flickering in her eyes for the first time. She opened her mouth, her voice trembling as she stammered, "Nathan, you don't have to do this. We can fix this. Let's just end things quietly and move on." I shook my head slowly, resolutely. "You think this is about revenge?" I asked, my voice steady and cold. "It's not. This is about accountability. You lied, You cheated, and you stole from me. The days of you walking away unscathed are over." Evan quickly intervened, his voice tight as he tried to regain control of the meeting. "Perhaps we should reconvene and discuss terms," he suggested. "No," I said sharply, standing up. "We're done here. Tell your client to prepare for court." As I walked out, a strange calm settled over me. The anger was gone, replaced by a quiet resolve. Emma had wanted a fight, and now she had one. But this time, I wasn't going to lose. The courtroom was packed when the hearing began. Emma sat at the defendant's table next to Evan, her expression pale but defiant. Her usual composure was cracking. A nervous glance here, a too-tight grip on her pen there. She knew the odds weren't in her favor, but her pride wouldn't let her show weakness. I sat across from her, my lawyer Sarah at my side. Sarah was everything I needed, sharp, relentless, and impeccably prepared. Her confidence radiated as the judge called the session to order and the proceedings began. Evan was the first to speak, spinning a narrative of irreconcilable differences and attempting to shift the focus to mutual incompatibility. His words were smooth, designed to downplay Emma's actions, but Sarah wasn't having it. When it was her turn, she stood with quiet authority. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and clear, "this is not a case of irreconcilable differences. This is a case of betrayal, financial misconduct, and deceit. My client has provided substantial evidence proving that Mrs. Parker engaged in an extramarital affair, misappropriated joint funds, and manipulated these proceedings to her advantage." She walked to the evidence table, holding up the folder Harris had prepared. "These bank statements show Mrs. Parker transferring tens of thousands of dollars to Mr. Jake Patterson, a known fraudster with a documented history of exploiting women for financial gain. These funds were taken from accounts jointly held by Mr. and Mrs. Parker without my client's consent." Evan objected, claiming the transfers were loans, but Sarah was ready. She pulled out screenshots of Jake's offshore account, along with records directly linking the transactions to Emma. "And if that weren't enough," Sarah continued, her voice rising slightly, "we have photographic and video evidence of Mrs. Parker's behavior that clearly demonstrates the nature of her relationship with Mr. Patterson. This is not about loans, Your Honor. This is about deliberate deception and misuse of marital assets." Emma shifted uncomfortably, her expression growing more strained with each passing second. The judge turned to Evan. "Do you have a response to these claims?" Evan stood visibly flustered. "Your Honor, while we acknowledge that mistakes may have been made, these allegations are being exaggerated. Mrs. Parker was under emotional distress and made decisions that, while regrettable, were not malicious." "Regrettable decisions?" Sarah shot back, her tone incredulous. "Misappropriating marital funds and engaging in an affair are not simply regrettable. They are deliberate actions that have caused significant harm to my client." The judge raised a hand to silence them and turned to me. "Mr. Parker, would you like to speak?" I stood, locking eyes with Emma. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady, "I spent years supporting Emma in every way a husband should. I worked hard to build a life for us, and I trusted her completely. That trust was shattered when I discovered the truth. Not only was she unfaithful, but she used our joint resources to fund her affair. This isn't just a betrayal of our marriage, it's a betrayal of every promise she ever made to me." Emma opened her mouth to respond, but the judge silenced her with a sharp look. "Mrs. Parker," the judge said, "do you have anything to say in your defense?" Emma hesitated, gripping the edge of the table tightly. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaky but defiant. "Your Honor, I made mistakes, but Nathan wasn't perfect either. He was distant, always buried in his work. I felt invisible, and Jake made me feel seen. I didn't mean for things to go this far." Her justification was met with silence. Even Evan seemed uncomfortable as she spoke. The judge leaned forward, his expression stern. "Mrs. Parker, feeling neglected does not excuse theft or deceit. The evidence against you is substantial, and it paints a clear picture of deliberate wrongdoing." The session ended with the judge calling for a recess. As I walked out of the courtroom, I felt Emma's eyes burning into my back. She wasn't defeated yet. Her pride wouldn't allow it. But the weight of her actions was finally catching up to her, and I wasn't done. Not yet. The fight wasn't over. but the cracks in Emma's armor were becoming more visible by the day. She had underestimated me, and now she was watching her carefully crafted world crumble. The aftermath of the court session was like a brewing storm, calm on the surface, but with chaos just beneath. Emma's silence wasn't a retreat. It was the eerie quiet before her next move, and I knew her well enough to expect that she would strike back when cornered. What I didn't expect was how far she'd go. 2 days later, Harris called. "Nathan," he said, his tone unusually grim, "we've got a situation. You need to see this." He forwarded me a link to a video from a local news outlet. My stomach churned as I pressed play. There was Emma standing outside the courthouse, tears streaming down her face as she addressed a reporter. "I'm just trying to rebuild my life," she said, her voice trembling. "But my husband is dragging me through the mud. He's weaponized the legal system against me, and I'm afraid for my safety." I clenched my fists so tightly that my knuckles turned white. She wasn't just doubling down on her lies. She was spinning a new story, painting me as a vindictive monster while leveraging public sympathy. The comments on the video were a mixed bag. Some people bought into her act, but others began questioning the cracks in her narrative. Still, it was clear that Emma wasn't done fighting. Later that evening, Harris called again. "I've been keeping tabs on Jake Patterson," he said. "You're going to want to hear this." "What now?" I asked, already bracing for the worst. "Jake skipped town," Harris explained. "Word is he caught wind of the court hearing and decided to disappear before things got too hot. But before he left, he emptied the offshore account Emma was funneling money into. She's broke, Nathan. She doesn't know it yet, but her golden boy just burned her." The irony hit me like a freight train. Emma had betrayed me for a con man, and now he'd done to her exactly what she'd helped him do to me. Instead of satisfaction, I felt something else. Opportunity. "Can we prove it?" I asked. "Absolutely," Harris replied. "We've got airtight records." The next day, Sarah and I met in her office to strategize. "We need to make this public," I said. "Emma's trying to control the narrative, but if we expose what Jake did, her whole story falls apart." Sarah nodded, her fingers flying across her keyboard. "We'll release it strategically. No emotion, no drama, just cold, hard facts." By the end of the day, everything was in place. Sarah contacted a trusted investigative journalist, and within hours the story went live. The headline was damning. "Local woman's affair with conman ends in financial ruin. Exclusive evidence unveiled." The article detailed Emma's financial transfers to Jake, his history of scams, and his disappearance with the funds. Screenshots of bank records and offshore accounts left no room for doubt. The fallout was immediate. Social media exploded with reactions. People who had once rallied behind Emma now turned on her, accusing her of deceit and recklessness. Friends who had supported her courthouse stunt now publicly called her out for her lies. That evening, my phone rang. It was Emma. For the first time in weeks, her voice sounded genuinely panicked. "Nathan, we need to talk," she pleaded. "Please." "Oh, now you want to talk?" I replied coldly. "What happened to only communicate through my lawyer?" "Please," she begged, her voice shaking. "I didn't know Jake was going to do this. I need help." I let out a bitter laugh. "Help? You're kidding, right? After everything you've done, you expect me to bail you out?" "Nathan," she said, her desperation growing, "if you don't help me, I'll lose everything." "You already have," I said firmly, "and you brought it on yourself." Before she could respond, I hung up. For the first time in months, I felt a profound sense of peace. Emma's lies had finally caught up with her, and I didn't need to lift a finger. Her own choices had done all the work for me. A few days later, I received a notification from Sarah. The court had set a final date for the divorce proceedings. Emma's strategy of smearing me publicly had backfired spectacularly. The news about Jake's con had turned the tide, leaving her isolated and scrambling. When the day came, I walked into the courtroom calm and confident. Emma, on the other hand, looked like a shadow of the woman I once knew. Her usually flawless appearance was disheveled, dark circles under her eyes, her hands trembling as she fidgeted with a pen. The hearing was swift. The judge, already familiar with the evidence we'd submitted, wasted no time cutting through the noise. Emma's attempts to defend herself were weak and unconvincing. The reality of her actions was undeniable. As I left the courthouse that day, I felt lighter than I had in years. The fight was over. Emma's web of lies had unraveled completely, and for the first time I was free. Her voice faltered as she tried to justify the bank transfers and her affair. The judge's stern gaze bore into her. "Mrs. Parker," he said, his voice resolute, "your actions not only violated the trust inherent in your marriage, but also involved financial misconduct that this court cannot overlook. Given the evidence presented, this court finds in favor of Mr. Parker." The gavel struck, and just like that it was over. The judge granted me the larger share of our marital assets and ordered Emma to pay restitution for the funds she had misappropriated. Emma's face crumpled as the weight of her actions fully settled on her. But the real blow came after the hearing. As I gathered my belongings, Evan approached me. His once smug demeanor was gone, replaced by exhaustion. "Mr. Parker," he began cautiously. "Off the record, I had no idea of the full extent of what Emma had done when I took this case. If I had known—" I cut him off, raising a hand. "It doesn't matter now, Evan. Just make sure your next client doesn't drag you down with them." He nodded, relief flashing across his face, and turned to leave. As I exited the courtroom, Emma was waiting on the steps outside. Her arms were crossed, her face a mix of anger and desperation. "Are you happy now?" she snapped. "You've ruined me, Nathan. Was that your plan all along?" I stopped in front of her, my face calm but resolute. "No, Emma. My plan was to protect myself and expose the truth. You ruined yourself when you lied, cheated, and thought you could walk away without consequences." She opened her mouth to argue but hesitated, her shoulders slumping as the fight drained out of her. For the first time in years, I saw a flicker of something genuine in her. Regret. "I didn't mean for it to end like this," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "But it did," I replied, my tone firm but not unkind. "And now we both have to live with the choices we made." Without another word, I walked past her, feeling the weight of the past months lift with each step. For the first time in years, I felt free, not just from Emma, but from the anger and betrayal that had consumed me. When I reached the bottom of the steps, Sarah was waiting by her car. She gave me a warm, triumphant smile as I approached. "It's over," she said simply. "No," I replied, glancing up at the clear blue sky. "It's just beginning." The days following the final hearing were a whirlwind of emotions: relief, vindication, and a strange sense of emptiness all mingled together. For so long my life had revolved around Emma's betrayal and the fight to expose the truth. Now that it was over, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into the unknown. But the peace that came with her absence was undeniable. No more manipulative phone calls, no more public stunts to smear my name. Emma had disappeared into the shadows, her reputation in tatters and her financial situation worse than ever. Jake's betrayal had left her completely exposed, and the people who once rallied behind her now avoided her like the plague. One quiet morning, as I sipped coffee in my now serene and empty home, I received an unexpected email. The subject line read simply, "Closure." Against my better judgment, I opened it. The message was long, rambling, and full of half-hearted apologies. Emma claimed she never intended to hurt me, that she had been caught up in her own unhappiness and made terrible choices. She blamed Jake for manipulating her, painting herself as another one of his victims. But there was no accountability, no genuine acknowledgement of the damage she'd done to me. It was just another attempt to rewrite the narrative in her favor. I didn't reply. I didn't see the point. Emma's words no longer mattered. She had become nothing more than a closed chapter in my life. A painful one, but closed nonetheless. Instead, I focused on moving forward. I threw myself into my work, which had been a lifeline through the chaos. My colleagues, who had been supportive throughout the ordeal, welcomed me back with open arms. Returning to the projects I loved felt like rediscovering a part of myself I had lost. I also began reconnecting with old friends, people I had unintentionally distanced myself from during my marriage. One evening I met up with Harris to thank him for his work. We sat at a quiet bar, the kind of place where conversations flowed without the need to shout over music. "You did good, Harris," I said, raising my glass. "I couldn't have done it without you." He shrugged, smirking. "You gave me one hell of a case to work on. Honestly, watching Emma's lies crumble in that courtroom was worth it." We laughed. But as the night went on, Harris leaned in with a serious expression. "So what's next for you, Nathan? What do you want now that this is all behind you?" It was a question I hadn't fully considered. For months, my focus had been on survival, on fighting back, and protecting what was mine. Now, with that battle over, I had the chance to start fresh. "I want to rebuild," I said after a pause. "Not just my life, but myself. Emma took a lot from me, but she didn't break me. I'm still standing, and I'm not going to waste this second chance." Harris nodded, lifting his glass. "To second chances, then." We clinked glasses, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't expected. Hope. Emma may have tried to destroy me, but in doing so, she taught me something invaluable. I wasn't just a survivor. I was stronger than I had ever realized. And with that strength, I was ready to step into the next chapter of my life, leaving her and all the chaos she brought far behind me. This is the end of the story, so don't forget to share your opinion and experience in the comments. And also, if you liked the story, subscribe to the channel that would not miss new vidoi.